Alright, so this will be an addendum to part 1 of the Metaphysics of the Perennial Philosophy series that I'm doing. And there was a lot there in the comment section of that first video that I would like to address. For anyone who is sincerely interested in understanding the Sophia Perennis, hearing some of these basic themes expanded upon and sometimes reiterated will help. Because it's not like a system with concrete parts that you can wrap your head around in a purely intellectual way. There is antinomy and paradox at the heart of this system. And I don't think that shows that there's a fault of the system. I think that demonstrates a limit of human cognition. And facing up to that limit is sometimes what distinguishes perennialist systems from those systems which, for example, Falun Dafa lays down certain axioms, and part of that is the infallibility of their leader, Li Hongzhi, and that doesn't really face the problem of the limitations of abstraction. He just invents his abstraction and uses it. So cults operate in that way. Religions, organized religions, inevitably end up operating in that way. But the true philosophy, the true nature of reality is such that we can't understand it with pure reason. So we need a critique of pure reason and a reorientation of our intellect along the lines of transcendental phenomenological analysis, which leads us into idealism, and that is Schopenhauer, and that is the German idealists, and that is as far as I believe the perennial philosophy has gotten. So I'm going to be trying to push that a little bit further, which is a pretty arrogant claim, but it is the task that I've set for myself. You can be the judge of how successful I am in that. But anyway, I think it's a worthwhile pursuit to understand this philosophy. This will be supplemental, however, so if you're not interested in the nitty-gritty of people's objections and my responses to them, then feel free just to watch the next part. And if you're not interested in the series as a whole, I would recommend unsubscribing. Not that this is all I'm going to be doing, but just if you don't like this, you don't get what I'm about. Alright, so Nicholas de Silencio is the single-celled organism at the top of the hierarchy of life forms. He's asking this analogously to my Platonic hierarchy of forms, where I put the undifferentiated at the top, because it's structurally basic. Anything else, any complex structure, relies on a simple unit at its base. Now, that doesn't necessarily involve a reification of these structures. We can be talking of structures of thought, and this still applies. So the language is grounded phenomenologically. The structure of thought is such that this hierarchy of forms manifests. And I think you don't understand the nature of thought if you don't acknowledge that this hierarchy is insuperable. It's part of your a priori nature, your nature. And everything you look at is tinctured by it. Inescapable. So Anna Kantavad asks, is there a hierarchy? And I say, yes, intrinsic to the way that you think. Homogeneity and specificity are the basis of conceptualization, and they establish these taxonomic hierarchies by necessity. Otherwise, you're just not thinking. Not thinking in the abstract sense of what thought means. There's a looser sense of thought, which is just brain activity, like mind activity. But as far as generating concepts, when you do that, you're employing abstraction, and you're employing the discursive method of drawing parallels between analogous patterns. So I'm going to read Nicholas's expansion on his analogy if the undifferentiated both constitutes the base and contains the hierarchy, then there is nothing other than or separate from the undifferentiated. Yes, the philosophy is ultimately monistic. There are people who call themselves traditionalists who are dualists, and that's just the way they think it is. But I think the correct interpretation of this wisdom literature is in the monistic vein. Like if you read the Vedas and the Upanishads, I believe, and I haven't read all the Vedas, just to qualify, I haven't read all of the Upanishads either, but I've read some stuff from all of that, and I think the logical interpretation is a monistic one, and so that's what I'll be arguing for. You're right in that. But when you say it has become and is becoming more complex and it has specialized parts, that's like sort of true, but not really, because it never really has separate parts. It never becomes anything. It hasn't become anything. It is, but the ultimate nature of the one in the Platonic sense is such that we can't ascribe any predicate to it and be fully accurate. I do not doubt the ability to rank any set of varied things into a hierarchy according to any arbitrary measure. For instance, I could rank my heart as having a higher status than my left kidney in a vitality hierarchy, or I could rank fermions at the top of a physical ontological hierarchy. But those hierarchical structures are not fundamental. They are fundamental to the way that you think. Now, I'm not talking about this kind of value hierarchy that you're talking about. I'm talking about a structural hierarchy where B depends upon A for its existence. A is a sine qua non of B. That sets a certain hierarchical relationship between A and B. B depends upon A. A does not necessarily depend upon B. That's a real difference. And recognizing that difference and then expanding upon it and systematizing it yields a taxonomic hierarchy that allows us to coherently orient our conceptual map of the world onto the world. And that's useful and not something to be eschewed because it, I guess, sniffs of totalitarianism, which I think is his ultimate critique here. Okay, so there's a lot of people who had an issue with the Omnipotence Paradox, which just out front, what I'm going to say is people, by and large, when they see a paradox, they want to resolve it and want to make it not a paradox. But I don't think anything that's been said here really resolves the paradox. I think it just shifts the antinomy to a more fundamental question. So, first, a rock so heavy that even an omnipotent being couldn't lift it does not have a referent. So heavy is a vague predicate. It either has a specific weight or it does not. It's like saying if God is all-powerful, he can create a, you see that. Since he can't create that, he is not all-powerful. Right. Now, we could argue about that, but I'm not going to try to defend this articulation of the question. And I also agree in the importance of well-grounded concepts. So we want to know what we're talking about when we say a rock so heavy that God couldn't lift it. But there is kind of a vague referent, it's an undefined referent, but it is a referent. Now the impossibility of that, the target of that, no, like I said, I'm not going to defend the articulation because it's not the strongest articulation of the paradox. So a more general phrasing, which doesn't run into this same problem, would be, can an omnipotent being render itself unomnipotent? Yes, but only if you think about God's omnipotence in isolation from his divine nature. If God could in some way reduce his power, then he would not have total dominion over his creation. If God had the power, could means to have the power to do something. So there are contradictions coming up in this, and I don't think ultimately it will be resolved in the way that you seem to think it is going to be resolved. There would be some element of creation that he wasn't able to control. That would lead to another paradox. Why is there a part of reality that God does not have control over? Because God chose to mitigate his power to demonstrate that he could do so. If he's less than omnipotent, can he make himself omnipotent again? Another quandary. Okay, so a preview of one of the arguments I'll make is that in the perennialist system, this does come up. God making himself less than omnipotent, becoming involved in samsara, being involved in maya, being the Purusha, the eternal man that projects Prakriti. Being that, is it possible to return once again to the inner being of the Atman? Can the Atman separate itself from the Jiva, or rather withdraw the projected world into itself once again and attain a state of unity? Can't God make himself God once he's made himself not God? Well, in perennialism, the answer is yes. God just has to do certain things as a mortal being. Like you have to do certain things to get back to that state. But, I'll get to that. The idea of God as the greatest possible being is that his attributes add to his greatness. God's attributes are intrinsically great-making properties. Therefore, a greatest possible being would not be able to mitigate his powers so that he wasn't omnipotent, because that would subtract from his greatness. All right, so God doesn't depend on having attributes that are intrinsically great-making properties, and the scale of greatness is not independent of this uncontingent reality behind phenomena. So God establishes the hierarchy of what's greatness. His attributes aren't defined by those which add to greatness, not prior to God's establishment of the gradient in question, the scale of goodness. So the paradox is not resolved along this route, saying that, though the attribute of not being able to do something would not be a great-making property, and therefore, it's not a property that he would have, it really doesn't resolve the paradox, because then you just ask, why couldn't God make it such that not being able to lift the rock is the great thing? And that's also something that perennialism will run into. Why enter into the world of illusion? Why enter into sin and suffering and all the badness that comes with the world? Maybe because it does culminate in something more heroic, something more transcendently beautiful than just God sitting and basking in his own splendor forever. Although maybe that is the best thing, but who determines what's the best among those candidate circumstances? The unconditioned. So the paradox is still there, is all I'm really saying. Perennialism just has, some answers, not in a strict logical sense, but answers that appeal to not necessarily the logical part of the soul, but something that we feel a truthiness to. Although it kind of attempts to address it logically. Not that it's possible to resolve this paradox logically, and the perennialist just chooses instead to use mystery language. Like in Taoism, the teacher articulates paradoxes to lead the student away from abstraction and trusting in our own sense of logic. A sense of logic that, contradiction and the metalogical laws, are intuitions. We don't know them apodeictically. Conclusions follow from them in logical systems apodeictically, but the starting intuitions themselves, even in geometry, are not, infallible. We don't know if they're perfect. So thought and abstraction is not the way to resolve this paradox. Reorienting the mind is the point of bringing up these paradoxes. These omnipotence paradoxes either involve God doing nonsensical things. God defines sense, first of all. Or doing something pointless. God determines meaning. The unconditioned determines everything. Making God less powerful. How do you know it's pointless? God could make that meaningful. And if he can't make that meaningful, is he really God? God's perfect greatness is bound up with his nature. If it's not bound up with his nature and his attributes are accidental, then yes, he can make himself less powerful, but that leads to other paradoxes. Yeah. Again, not really resolving the paradox, just kind of quoting like scholastic type reification of our abstractions and attempting to apply them to God when they're not coherent as applied to God in this sense, where you're saying stuff like, his perfect greatness is bound up with his nature, therefore he's constrained to be great, but he's the one who determines greatness. Like, if he doesn't determine his own attributes, then he is, in some sense, a conditioned being. Thinking about God is beyond any sense of determination in the first place. So, I'll just leave it at that. All right. So this is a similar objection, I think, the idea of the referent being ill-defined. Yeah, he's saying, like, you can't articulate the paradigm or the paradox using the same kind of language we would use. Anyway, you can read this comment. It's basically the same objection, that it's a lack of a definite referent to the activity in question. So it's like the paradox isn't real, you're just like saying nonsense, and that's all. That's all that's happening. Yeah, okay, so he thinks that it does resolve the paradox, but not my version of it. So I'm pointing to what I believe is the most general formulation of the paradox, which is the infinite finite? Or can the infinite be finite? I think is the infinite finite is probably the best way to formulate it. And he says, well, my answer up here, which you can read, just pause it. My answer up here does address the paradox, just not my version of it. No, I think that up there is a special case of the more general question that I'm bringing out. To address that, I would point out that saying God is constrained by his nature, like you or me or beings in general, is a fundamental mistake, because that can only be true for things/beings whose essence and existence are separate. So here we're jumping straight into dogmatic theology and scholasticism, and I don't think that you have a good warrant for this. Like, it can only be true that a being is constrained by its nature if its existence and its essence are separate. I don't think that's really been demonstrated. I don't think it's been demonstrated that essence and existence are really separate. I don't think any attribute is really separate. I think they're all different ways of representing the same fact of the totality of the being of the thing in question. So if by essence you mean the type to which you belong, which I've seen some people use essence in this sense, or by essence you mean essential qualities, the qualities that are the sine qua non. I don't know how to pluralize Latin properly, so forgive me. But that are the sine qua non of the thing in question. If that's the essence and the existence is the being there or not being there, I don't think those are separate. The categories aren't really separate. They're talking about the same thing, just in a different articulation. That's my opinion of it. And so, you can bring out Thomas Aquinas and educate me however you want to, or I don't know who you subscribe to. But that's not the case for God as classically defined, which means it doesn't make sense to say that his essence constrains or limits what he can be or do, because his essence and his existence are one and the same. Yeah, which means he has a unified nature. There's a unity to God, and the nature is what it is. And like some people are saying, it's intrinsically great, as opposed to not great. Like, you're ascribing particularized characteristics to God, and saying, like, does he determine his attributes? Because if they're one and the same, are they determined? I think the paradox is still present, even with this classical theist concept of God, because you're just pushing it back to within God himself. Could God be otherwise than he is? Could God change, or is he self-tractable, or is he self-intractable? And And that's the nature of the underlying question and the paradox, because if he is intractable, then it would seem that he lacks the power to change himself, which even I have the power to change myself. I, as a finite being, do I have a power that God doesn't have? Or if he can change himself, then, well, he's eternal. How does change happen for a being like that? So the paradox stands is really, it is a little boring because all I'm saying is like, there's a paradox, you guys aren't solving it. And it's not a position that I like being in. I'd much rather be the one assailing a paradox. But I do have my solution, which I can't remember if I addressed it a little bit earlier, but in perennialism, yes, you can, as God, not create a rock so large that you can't lift it. You can do it because I can't lift certain rocks. You can't lift certain rocks. Hence, God can't, in certain circumstances, in certain aspects, in certain perspectives, lift certain things. But then the inability to do so, the less than omnipotent quality of the actor, is itself illusory. It's part of the Matrix. So like in the Matrix, the movie, Morpheus tells Neo, like, why are you breathing so heavy? Or whatever the line is, you don't need oxygen here. You know, do you think those are your muscles, or whatever he asks? That's the point. Like, our constraints and our limitations and the laws of physics and all of that is illusory. Limits are illusory. That doesn't mean that we're not gonna be in this circumstance for a long, long time. And to really explain how they're illusory would require, like, what I'm going to talk about in future videos. So I can't at the moment. But I'm not the only person to believe this. I think it's one of the oldest philosophies out there. In the ancient Greek world, Pythagoras and Parmenides, at least, were certainly influenced by perennialism, probably coming from India. Probably it was the Advaita Vedanta philosophy, the Upanishadic philosophy, that moved through Mesopotamia to reach the Greeks. Pythagoras did come from Western Anatolia anyway. So it's an old philosophy. And I'll leave it at that for now. Okay, so this objection, I think basically it boils down to the same thing that Anna Kontavad and Nicholas de Silencio earlier were saying, which is that the hierarchies that I'm imposing are arbitrary in some sense, and maybe there's kind of like spectrums between the on and off at that fundamental level. But I think he doesn't address, when I try to shift the focus of this, you can read all of this if you choose to, when I try to shift the perspective to the binary quality of presence or absence, regardless of whether things manifest as spectra and have like a sliding scale between attributes, a point on that scale is either present or absent, and there's nothing in between that. Now, in this comment, he doesn't really address that. And I'm saying that is the basis of form in the first place, in any attribute. And the complex hierarchies that allow for the manifestation of the spectra stem from really basic ontological things, very simple properties, like being there or not being there. And I don't think that's something that I'm doing arbitrarily. I think that's just sound phenomenological analysis, and I think that you're missing it. So, I wish I could... never mind. I had the last word, even though it was a short word in this. There's a lot of people who have the smell of postmodernism on them in the comments, and bullshit takes like 1/10 of the time to produce than it does to address. Really, no offense to this commenter, because I think they've been subscribed to me for quite some time. But I don't think that... One of the problems that I brought out here was that if you want to think in this way of avoiding like hard determinations of qualities, and talking about everything is kind of like murky and shifting and between things, then clear communication is not possible. And clear communication is necessary for survival. So like even if phenomenologically grounded like formal hierarchies weren't good philosophy, even if I'm doing something wrong when I'm doing that, they still have survival value. And if you're not around to live, then you're not around to philosophize, and the criticism is just kind of moot criticism. Because what's the alternative? An incommunicable system that's not a system. All right, so that's like a perennialist type concept. A lot of people are going to accuse me of Eastern mysticism, but I'll have you know that Hinduism is an Aryan system and classical theism is a Semitic system. Which I think you can make an objection to that by saying that the philosophers that developed the system weren't themselves Semites in most cases, but it derives from a Semitic tradition. Abrahamic theology is different from Dharmic theology, and what I'm articulating is closer to Dharmic theology. And it's not really theology in a strict sense, because the notion of the theos is just different from the notion of the Platonic one. Or, well, even though in Plato's mind it is sort of similar. He talks about God in a sense that is that summum bonum, that the idea of the good is basically one and the same with God. But, all right, so asking about Langen. Yeah, another perennialist type comment. This, if God is eternal, well, you can kind of imagine an eternal being that has spatial limitations, like, a square sitting in a space forever, with no time, but with space. Now, you could say that, though, that, like, really, that spatial property is not possible without time, which is fair. But is God good? I can't address this yet. But basically, like, any predicate doesn't really apply in a straightforward sense to the undifferentiated or the one divinity. We can't ever talk about God directly. So even saying, like, is God good? Well, like, yes and no. He transcends the duality between good and evil that we know. Like, even Protestants recognize that, like, God's ultimately behind Satan. Like, Satan is controlled by God. Everything is controlled by God. Everything that seems to be good and seems to be evil. Now, I don't solve it with, like, the demiurge or any kind of dualistic formulation. But let's just say that if God does things that in the utilitarian calculation, if you could do it of all being, that at least he's doing it to himself, because he's the ultimate soul of all beings. So he creates suffering, but then he's the one who endures it. So it ultimately has to be, at least bare minimum, kind of morally neutral, because he's the one who's suffering it. Like, if I punch myself in the face right now, is that evil? Like, I did it, but I also suffered it. It's not like if I did it to somebody else, then maybe. But, which is, yeah, the Semite God is sadistic. The perennialist God is not, because there's nothing for him to be a sadist to, because all is him. He's also a lot braver than the Abrahamic God. The Abrahamic God wants credit for just being the best, but it's like you never experienced limitation. In the book of Job, how do you not have more sympathy for Job? Like, God can do anything. God is never going to be in Job's shoes. And I think you have more sympathy for Job. This, I believe, is actually a version of the perennialist answer, if I understand his logic correctly. And I kind of agree with what he's saying here. Like, the apparent duality, good and evil, leads us to the transcendent. Meister Eckhart says that everything we experience is intended to lead us back to God. And I say in a comment above that, like, suffering is intended to lead us back to God. All right. My take on the rock question is that a better phrasing would be, can God make himself not God? I think you'd agree that this is fundamentally the same question, but more direct. If God made himself not God, yeah, which I think the most direct formulation is the infinite finite. But yeah, that is a good formulation. If God, and I made it myself in a comment below, if God made himself not God, then he would not have the power to make himself not God, so he cannot. This conclusion is apparently a limitation of God, but is it really? How can the limitation of not being limited be a limitation? Well, if God, suppose he wanted to know what it was like to be limited. Like, maybe he would know in some omniscient sense what it would be like, but would he know the direct personal experience of going through it? Maybe he knows all the details of it. But here's another advantage I think perennialism has over classical theism, because in classical theism, radical simplicity necessitates that omniscience and omnipotence are the same property ultimately. All attributes are the same property. Well, how is that? In the perennialist system, all knowledge is power. Power and knowledge are one and the same, because creating the limited being, like the world experience of the limited being, is projected by Purusha, projected by the ultimate being. And that creation of it is what the knowledge of it is. It's never anything other than that. Knowledge is always that power. And so if he doesn't know, or if he doesn't have the power of being not all-powerful, then he doesn't have the knowledge of that state in perennialism, which seems like a limitation. But here we are talking kind of like elliptically about God, or obliquely, and you can't make any headway trying to make direct cataphatic statements about God and his hypothetical limitations, because we can't be reifying our system of logic and the metalogical laws of the identity of God even, and just assuming that the intuitions that we experience are grounded in something like that's absolutely ontologically fundamental. We really can't be sure of that. So and without, notwithstanding all of these caveats and qualifications, I think that perennialism, in all that it explains, in all that it addresses, in a holistic sense, has an advantage over classical theism, or just theism generally. Which I'll clearly be seeking to bring out in the course of several videos. In one of your replies, I mentioned, is the infinite finite? Infinity must be confined to the law of identity, which proclaims it to be infinite. But is it confined to the metalogical laws? Are the metalogical laws prior to, if infinity is there, then it contains the metalogical laws and is not contained or confined to them, right? The paradox is certainly still there. But by saying that infinity is limited to the law of identity, aren't we really saying that infinity is limited to its identity of not being limited? This is not a limitation. But you use the word limited to its identity of not being limited, so in what sense is it not a limitation? Being not allowed, like I am not able to be a cockroach, seemingly. But that is a limitation. Just because I'd be moving down on the scale of power, I'd be becoming less omnipotent. It doesn't really work that way, but still, becoming less powerful, not being able to become less powerful is still a limit to your power. Even though remaining as you are is staying in the most powerful state. I recommended some books to this guy. I think I already mentioned that one, but you could read that. Why am I Catholic? So why are you Catholic? The traditionalist school addresses this, And it's that there are no perennialist churches. And there's always a small minority who, gets this philosophy. Analytically, a very small minority. And then those who actually do what it says to do and follow the ethical prescriptions are a much smaller minority than that. So there's no option for perennialists to organize religiously. And it doesn't make sense with a philosophy. So therefore, the traditionalist school says whatever you were born into, usually you make that your ritual. And the ritual aspect is what's really important in it. But even so, I think that the Catholic theology has been trending towards something closer to perennialism, and maybe in 1,000 years it'll be explicitly perennialist. I wouldn't be surprised at all if that happened. Maybe quicker than that. We can't think beyond the existence of a quantum nature to the most fundamental elements of any system observed by any observer. I've been thinking along the same lines, but in reference to being itself, which, you can't really think about being itself in the way that... So Schopenhauer makes this critique of being, saying it's really just the infinitive of the copula, and reifying it as the basic ontological reality. Like, we're stepping outside the bounds of justified, warranted speech when we talk like that, which I inevitably have to do talking about metaphysics as well. But, at least I'm admitting that there's a very present limit to what I'm able to address linguistically. It's driving me crazy, the question of what the I is that constitutes my experience, or even if that's too much of a presupposition to begin with. In perennialism, the I is all. All is the I. That's the answer to that. It's like we've hit a limit, but I'm curious because it has implications on free will. If you have any thoughts on this, or we'll cover this in some later video, it would be most appreciated. Yeah, it has implications for free will in that I'm going to make an argument explicitly for this, the transcendental unity of all subjectivity. All subjectivity is necessarily one, insofar as what we mean by subjectivity is what's in question here, which I think we can do a transcendental phenomenological analysis and justify that within the parameters of mind as we know it. All right, so this is a bunch of stuff, and I've already done this for so long, 38 minutes. I don't have the endurance anymore to be having like 2-hour-long streams. Not that I ever did that on a regular basis, but even conversations, like, I get tired of talking after a while. Not like I used to. Okay, so to summarize what the dispute is here, he's claiming that when I critique classical theism as being arbitrary, saying that classical theism has to resort to God just felt like doing it this way, I'm misunderstanding God's freedom or God's creation. I understand that God doesn't have liberty of indifference, where he has multiple options set before him and then he has to choose certain ones. So that's not exactly the arbitrary problem that I'm outlining. And there's no serious difference between God just feeling to like doing something and God's nature just being such that this creation emanates from him. So, yeah. Yeah, so this is interesting. He says, why, the question, why is God's nature as it is, isn't necessarily a coherent question. For there to be an explanation of God's nature in the ordinary sense of what an explanation is, there would have to be something outside of God which determines his nature. Yeah, so we can't explain it, but we could still hypothetically ask it. Although, why pertains to a cause in the world as we know it, or like a ground or reason according to like the principle of sufficient reason in the mind that we experience. So asking a question of why about the undifferentiated or unconditioned is in a sense a misapplication. And it's true. It is. But it's not the arbitrarity that I'm highlighting. It's not that you can't explain God and therefore classical theism is arbitrary, or you can't explain his nature. The problem, and I'll just move to where we like get that out there. So I say here, how does that address the problem of an arbitrary finite creation? So the finite world that classical theism posits is arbitrary because it has borders that are particular in certain ways. And there's a lot of complexity in the limits of the world. Now you can say that God creates those limits. I'm going to use this drawing thing again. All right, so in classical theism, there's God, and then there's the world. Whereas in perennialism, there's just God and the world, and in this circle, we're going to say like every point in the circle is the whole circle. So there's a holographic quality to God in perennialism. And then from the center of each point, which is the whole, there's a projection of Maya, which is the identity of all that which is perceived in Maya is the whole as well. There's a lot of self-recursive aspects to perennialism. But anyway, there's not this hard divide. The apparent divide is being explained, like what the classical theist takes to be this relationship is explained in that relationship there. And God creates the world, but we don't have to posit that the world, the limitation of the world is an ontological limitation. We could say that, well, our sight ends here. Our sight ends here, not necessarily the world ends here. And that's saying that, like, if the observable universe is the real universe and nothing is beyond it, that's a stronger claim than the observable universe is all we can observe. So what's the grounds for positing the limits of the finite world in classical theism? That is the arbitrary move. Because you don't have to posit that the limits are real. You can say that the limits are apparent. And that's the difference between illusion and Maya, which is a simpler claim, and creation, and what I take to be materialism, which is a more complex claim, because you're putting forward more positive material in the form of limits. You'll notice that infinite, the word infinite, is a negative statement. It's not limited. There's no limit here. But if you're saying that it is finite, that there is a limit, then explain the limit. Now, if you're just going to draw a line back to God, which is a box with a question mark in it, you're not explaining it, and you've just posited something with no ground whatsoever. And that is the arbitrary element of the system. There's no ground whatsoever for the finitude of the world in classical theism, or in any system, really. Which is why positing that is not like Occam's razor. What are we explaining by saying that the world's finite? Nothing. And if we don't say the world's finite, then we explain an awful lot. We can explain why the laws of physics are such as they are because the anthropic principle. We don't have to appeal to a creator to fine-tune things such that life exists. It's like, of course life exists, because in an infinite world, it would have to. Everything would have to. All right. Yeah, and so he's going to kind of turn the tables on me and say that, well, perennialism is also arbitrary because, like, what accounts for the distinction between the individual soul and the universal soul? What accounts for Maya? Why is the illusion produced? Like, you're asking, why is creation produced? But no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying, why is creation produced? I'm saying, why is creation limited? If you took classical theism and made creation unlimited, then basically you would remove the distinction between creation and God. And that would basically melt into perennialism. So it's not that you can't explain God or you can't explain creation, rather. Like, I can't explain in a fundamental sense, I can't say why the mind is here, or why Maya is here, why illusion is here, because that would be a misapplication of why, just like it is in classical theism, to say why is God this way. Because why only applies in the realm of the principle of sufficient reason, the structure, the a priori structure of our perception and our conception. That's what why applies to. That's what all our language applies to. And anything stepping beyond that is analogical or apophatic, just like classical theism. So that's the same. We're on the same grounds there. The arbitrary element is when you say the world is finite, because that doesn't follow necessarily from your definition of God. So it's arbitrary. And the two elements of the system, I say it's incoherent, and I did in the video, because God and the world are just two discrete elements. There's no connection intellectually, paradigmatically, in the worldview. There's no connection. There's just creation, which is just a vague notion. We can't talk about it analytically. We can't analyze the notion of creation, because creation, like all of God's actions, is one in being with his essence. So it's really not coherent. It's just not a coherent system. Perennialism, it is illusion coherent with God's being. It's the way it is. We can't talk about it with apodeictic certainty, because logic and the principle of sufficient reason doesn't apply to that meta question of why logic exists, or why the structure of the mind exists. But, like, analogically, we can say, well, an infinite being, an unconstrained being, would know viscerally, phenomenologically, the experience of being all finite beings. It would be the set of all finite beings, and also infinitely more than that. So some people would like to apply the label panentheism to perennialism, and I think that's, adequate. It's a pretty good label. All right. So I didn't reply to his last comment, and I will, you can see. Personally, I would rather interact with shorter comments where we can each kind of just get, in a Socratic way, like, get what we agree on, get what we disagree on out there on the table, and then hammer out the details. Whereas long rants like this, you just end up getting into, like, rhetorical battles. Your objections haven't been left to stand. I was merely pointing out that regarding the finitude and ontological distinctness of the world from God as arbitrary doesn't put you in any better position than that of classical theists, since the very problem that you think this distinction represents simply reappears in your own system in a different guise. And I have addressed this. The problem is not that there's, the world and God. And there's also illusion and not illusion, or illusion and being. Like, that duality still kind of appears, but the arbitrariness of the finite world with its particular borders does not have the limitation, or is, it's putting more positive material out there than illusion constitutes an unlimited array of phenomenological materials. Purusha projects Prakriti, but projects absolutely everything. And this is in common with Spinoza. Although I think that Spinoza was kind of a materialist, believed that God was a substance, and just doesn't show evidence of recognizing the limitations of logic. Basically, before the critique of pure reason, he didn't get the critique, the transcendental critique. It reappears, and will it reappear? There's an element of it that will reappear. There's a fundamental antinomy that won't be resolved, but we can introduce further matter, like the finite border of the universe and its particular qualities, and we don't have to introduce that. So that's really the distinction. It doesn't matter whether the question is why/how did God create a finite world distinct from himself if God is infinite, or if the question is, why does God need there to be sin in order to know the consequences of sin? So above, I made that argument, but talking about God and necessity, it was analogical. It's just kind of a best fit, like feels good explanation in the perennialist system for why, like explaining the problem of evil. We can't ever perfectly address this with reason, but it seems intuitively plausible, basically, that for God to really know the condition of the sinner, he has to become the sinner, in a sense. To really, like Christ descends to the depths of hell and then reascends into the heavens. And that serves a purpose, I'm sure. Now, I know that Ivan's not a Christian, so maybe he doesn't. And Christianity is more perennialist than Judaism or Islam, with the exception of Sufism. And there's also perennialists, Neo-Platonic schools of Judaism since the Middle Ages. I mean, Kabbalistic Judaism does have elements of perennialism in it. But it's very easy to corrupt. Luciferianism has elements of perennialism in it. It's one of those, a lot of the components of perennialism are just present in the philosopher, embedded on our being, because that being is grounded in the truth, the ultimate truth. And so, of course, it will reappear all over the world. And so it gets a bad reputation by association with things, I think, a lot, perennialism does. Why does God even need to know the consequences of sin at all? Given that God could have existed in an entirely undiminished splendor had the world and sin never existed in the first place. For the omniscience to be the greatest possible omniscience, I don't know. Or just like a limitation on being in general. Not just God, but being of the world and God. The set of every possible thing. Why should there be a limit on it? I think the limit, given that there is stuff, we see that stuff exists, there's either going to be, one of three things. There's nothing, and this will be nothing, this weird shape here will be nothing, nothing, something, which will be a square, and then all things. And this is arbitrary, and there's particular borders to the something that things are. This is eliminated because there's stuff here. And then all is the other option, and I find that to be the most parsimonious. One can also ask, why is there even this split that you refer to between the individual soul and the universal soul at all, which you say necessitates suffering for the individual soul in order to... Yeah, so why is this split? You can't address it. Reason can't solve this, and so the antinomy is still present, just like it is in classical theism. But the difference between Maya and creation, maybe they're closer, like on a common footing there, in terms of the problems of analyzing that element of the system. But it's an additional element of the finitude of creation that is problematic in a way that's unique to classical theism and not shared in common with perennialism. So I see the instinct to like turn it back around on perennialism and say that, well, all of your system has all the same problems. No, there's one problem that we don't have. We don't have to explain the limits on anything because we don't posit real limits. You say real limits exist. I say they don't. I say apparent limits exist. Limitations to thought exist. Limitations to perception. Limitations of perspective. And those limits, like why are they there? Well, without limits, you wouldn't have the perspective. So in order to have all perspectives, you have to have all limits. Again, like this is, you have to get to a level of metaphorical language, religious type language, mystic language when you talk about it. But there's a sense that it makes in the perennialist paradigm that I think that sense is not made in classical theism. All it does is set up a larger set of starting axioms than perennialism does. The set of starting axioms is larger, and it admits that it can't really justify those axioms because they're axioms. But I'd rather have the system with the smaller set of starting principles that can't be justified. That's Occam's razor. One can also ask, why is there this split? Yeah, so you kind of get that objection. I personally think it's much more natural and simple to see God as creating a finite world distinct from himself than to see him as injecting finitude into himself by creating a grand illusory split between individual souls and the universal soul. So I prefer the classical approach to perennialism, but I wouldn't use the above considerations to call perennialism arbitrary. Yeah, that's that distinction. And you keep on using, like, inserting finite in here. If you removed finite and just said God creating a world is just as problematic as, divinity or God creating limitation to himself in the form of all of these jivas to the one Atman. Like, there's a similar sort of problem there, but I've, beat that horse enough. All right, I had to move some chairs. So, I can't remember exactly where I was. This so-called problem of the arbitrariness of God's creation appears in some guise in any conceivable theological system. It's not really a problem so much as a consequence of the fact that language simply fails us when we try to discuss God directly. Yes, yeah, the arbitrariness of God's creation is not what he thinks I'm accusing him of. The arbitrariness is the elements of the logical system that you're bringing forward, the finitude, the limits themselves. And also up here, actually no, I want to go forward on this. So, yeah, just moving forward, it certainly doesn't fall from the fact that God is pure act, that he needs there to be sin in order to know the consequences of sin. No, not logically. Like, this is a realm of thought where you can assert some things about the nature of God analogically, apophatically, and then I can assert some things, and like neither of us have any firm grounds for it. The test for me, the epistemological scheme, would be: does it accord with experience? Does it account for experience? And are the premises as simple as possible? The premises of my system are simpler because I'm not introducing the notion of this discrete category of the created world that has an essence or a substance that's somehow not God, that it's not God at the center of awareness. Like, what is it then at the center of awareness? I think those elements are just not addressed in classical theism, which is why I said that, like, it's comprehensive enough that it seems to account for enough stuff that you can, like, be satisfied with it. But there are questions at the periphery that you don't have a solution to, where you do have. So perennialism has greater explanatory power and fewer presuppositions. And just, we'll go through the series and see if you agree that that's the case. Yeah, I don't agree that all perspectives are intrinsic to the divine nature, at least not if you mean by that what it sounds like. So he's saying, like, it's not just the set of all perspectives that constitutes omniscience, it's fundamentally of a different character. Well, you can say that it's of a different character necessarily because God's attributes are one, which I agree with that analysis, and so does, like, Taoism and the other mystical systems, that there's a mystery at the heart of being, divinity. But the like, you saying that God's being doesn't still contain, although it's radically separate, doesn't still contain the set of all individual knowledges from individual knowers. Like, that's just, you could say that, and I can say it does, and none of us is truly justified on that basis alone. But I think using that, we can, again, account for more things in the world with fewer starting axioms. Okay, you've agreed that there aren't really any transitions from potentiality to actuality, but that these are merely apparent. But why would there even be an appearance of such things? This returns us to the question of why God generated the illusion everyone is subject to, and the distinction between the individual and universal soul. That is the basic question, and everything in your system, so far as I can see it, ultimately collapses into it. And there's a way in which it makes sense to me that in order for the undifferentiated chaos to be something different than nothing, it has to be at the same time all things. And this unity of all things and nothing, this unity of infinity, no thing and infinite are kind of the same, because a thing is a limited entity, whereas nothing is no thing. So they're kind of the same. For infinity and nothing to be the same, or to reconcile with totality or the sum of all being, this holographic principle works and addresses the problem, although not in a strictly analytical way where it's necessarily going to convince someone because of the power of the reason itself. And it is phenomenologically grounded in that it directs you, this whole system directs you to an experimental path within yourself, a mystic path. And most people are not prepared for it. I'm not prepared for it, which is why I'm talking about it. The people who are really prepared for it are not people talking about it, because they recognize the ultimate futility of talking about it. But yeah, we're on the same kind of ground in that we're both left with this apparent division. The created world, finite world, world of perception, and then the unlimited that we logically adduce. And, like, how do I resolve that? There's just kind of a parsimony in saying that the set of everything that's possible is the same as the ground of that possibility itself. Otherwise, there's, like, totality sits so far away from the ground of being. And the tree of complexity, like, if it's God and then the world, then you still all of a sudden have this structure that it's a real structure, and the set of God and the world has to be reconciled. Now you can say, like, oh, God doesn't fit into any set, but to, like, maybe we're just dealing with our intuitions are structured differently on this matter, and it's like you can't convince someone of a geometric proof if they don't share the intuition that it's based off of. Although we more or less all share the geometric intuitions, we don't share this intuition apparently. But I think parsimony helps me on this. Occam is helping me out here. This makes it analogous to classical theism. Yeah. What the right sense of determination is opaque. Yeah, we can't know God directly. Yeah, I'm not... The opacity or the lack of ability to identify how creation happens is not the problem. Just like I can't precisely describe how the projection of Prakriti by Purusha happens. But that's kind of just the given. Like, the perceptual world is given. Now, how do we account for it? You posit a whole finite world with finite qualities and independent material existence. Although maybe it's still somehow grounded in the being of God in classical theism. I don't put that forward, and I don't need it. I don't need there to be a separate world for my system still to work, and it's still to account for everything. Like, there's no experimental fact that's going to be a problem for me. Now, according to Karl Popper, it's not scientific, which, yeah, it's a philosophy, it's not a science, perennialism, but in another sense, it is a science, and it is falsifiable, because you can dedicate your life to asceticism and meditation and pursuing the mystic path and be proved wrong. But then again, like, you can't really know if you just failed or if it's truly impossible to return to the one. But okay, I've gone on long enough, and my family's home, so thank you for listening.